The phrase 6 feet under is so deeply woven into everyday language that most people never stop to question it. It sounds official, almost scientific, as if it were etched into law somewhere. But here's the quiet truth most people don't realize. 6 feet was never a universal rule, and today it's largely a relic of fear, tradition, and misunderstanding. If you've ever wondered why modern graves are often much shallower, you're about to uncover a story shaped by plague, labor, land scarcity, biology, and changing values. And if this kind of everyday mystery explained clearly is your thing, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Why the 6-foot grave became associated with death in the first place. The idea of burying the dead 6 feet underground can be traced back to 17th century England during the Great Plague of London in 1665. At that time, tens of thousands were dying, and panic ruled decision-making. Officials ordered that graves be dug at least 6 feet deep, believing that deeper burials would prevent the spread of disease, block foul odors, and stop animals from disturbing bodies. Germ theory did not exist yet, so people relied on what they could see and smell. If decay caused stench, then burying bodies deeper felt like a logical solution. This directive was more about calming fear than applying science, but once it entered public consciousness, it stuck. How a temporary rule slowly hardened into a cultural myth. The 6-foot guideline was never consistently enforced, even in England. In reality, grave depth varied widely depending on soil, tools, weather, and urgency. But the number sounded authoritative, and authority has a way of turning suggestions into traditions. As burial customs traveled across Europe and into North America, the phrase came along for the ride. Over time, 6 feet under evolved from a crisis response into a poetic shorthand for death itself. The language survived long after the reasoning behind it faded. Why digging 6-foot graves was never as common as people think. Manually digging a 6-foot grave is brutal work. For centuries, this meant shovels, pickaxes, and human endurance. Rocky ground, frozen soil, and high water tables often made such depths impractical or impossible. In many cemeteries, graves ended up closer to 4 or 5 feet, simply because that was achievable. The goal was to bury the body deep enough to discourage scavengers and control odor, not to hit a precise measurement. Practicality usually won, even if the language said otherwise. Why do modern cemeteries no longer aim for 6 feet? Well, today, burial depth is governed by local regulations rather than tradition. In most places, there is no legal requirement for a 6-foot grave. Instead, cemeteries focus on what actually matters: safety, sanitation, and land management. A typical modern burial places the top of the casket about 3 to 4 feet below the surface. This depth is sufficient to prevent odor, avoid interference from animals, and allow cemetery equipment to operate safely. Anything deeper adds cost and labor without meaningful benefit. How has land scarcity quietly changed burial practices? Space has become one of the most powerful forces shaping modern burials. Cemeteries, especially in cities, are running out of room. Shallower graves allow for more efficient use of limited land. In some locations, double-depth graves are used, where one casket is placed above another with a barrier in between. This approach would be impossible if every burial required 6 feet of depth per person. As populations grow and urban land becomes more valuable, burial practices adapt whether tradition approves or not. What does science say about decomposition and burial depth? Well, decomposition depends on oxygen, microbes, temperature, and soil conditions. A body buried very deep experiences less oxygen, which can slow decomposition dramatically. Shallower graves allow microbial life to do its work more efficiently. This is especially important for natural or green burials, which aim to return the body to the earth without embalming or synthetic materials. In these cases, deeper burial actually works against the intended process. From a biological standpoint, 6 feet can preserve rather than return, turning the grave into a time capsule instead of part of a natural cycle. Why, you might wonder, have green burials made shallow graves more acceptable? Well, as environmental awareness has grown, so has interest in burial methods that, minimize ecological impact. Green cemeteries favor biodegradable shrouds or coffins and avoid embalming chemicals altogether. These practices actually require shallower graves to allow for proper interaction between the soil and the remains. So, the shift away from that old 6 feet is not negligence. It's intentional. The goal here is balance rather than permanence. Honestly, this marks a major philosophical change from past centuries, when preservation and separation from the earth were really prioritized. Now, let's talk about how regulations have replaced tradition. There isn't a single burial standard across countries, or even within states. In the United States, burial depth is typically determined by cemetery policy and local health departments. And factors like soil type, climate, and groundwater levels actually play a much larger role than folklore ever did. Cremated remains, by the way, require even less depth, since there's no decomposition concern. So, what replaced the 6-foot rule is not chaos, but, customization. Burial practices now respond to real conditions instead of just inherited assumptions. Why did the phrase survive even when the practice didn't? Well, language is stubborn. 6 feet under endured because it was vivid, simple, and emotionally charged. Even as burial methods changed, the metaphor, just remained useful. Many people still assume it reflects reality, when in fact it hasn't for generations. This disconnect between language and practice is actually pretty common in traditions surrounding death, where symbolism often outlives function. So, what does the end of 6-foot graves really represent? The move away from 6-foot burials reflects a broader shift in how societies approach death. These days, people value sustainability, personalization, and practicality over rigid tradition. Whether it's through cremation, green burial, or alternative memorials, the focus is definitely on meaning rather than measurement. 6 feet was never sacred. It was a response to fear, frozen in language long after the fear passed. Understanding this doesn't diminish the past. It actually clarifies it, and it reminds us that even the most familiar phrases often hide stories worth uncovering. If this explanation added something new to how you see the world, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who enjoys learning the hidden logic behind everyday beliefs. Simple things become far more interesting once you understand why they exist.